Hello, I'm Noel Kingsbury, and with Annie Guilfoyle, I run Garden Masterclass. Now, this event is a recording of one of our Thursday garden chats, which happen at 6 o'clock London time every Thursday evening. This is a pro bono event, which we started doing in April 2020 during the first lockdown. Our aim is to talk to interesting and entertaining garden people. They could be gardeners, they could be amateur growers, they could be designers or botanists. And we talk to people from all over, from the Americas, from the Southern Hemisphere, from Asia. We like to think that we bring you the cutting edge of horticulture and our engagement with plants. So all of these recordings go on to our YouTube channel and eventually move on to our website. And the best ones are for members only. Our membership entitles you to access to premium material, to a forum, to keep in touch with other members and perhaps seek or offer information, and various discounts and special invitation-only events. Or, if you like, you can just keep in touch by signing up for our monthly email newsletter. So all of this is explained on our website, gardenmasterclass.org. So here's hoping you will enjoy this recording, and hoping perhaps you'll come and join us, or at least keep in touch. Well, today, Annie and I are both out and about, so we're playing a recording. And this recording, in fact, I made back in August with a lady in New Zealand, Xanthe White, a garden designer, who I was first introduced to by Claire Takash when we were looking for garden designers or gardens to feature in the book I did that came out earlier this year with Phaidon, Wild, the Naturalistic Garden. We were looking for Southern Hemisphere gardens. We found a rather spectacular one in South Island, which we featured in one of our very early lockdown Thursday chats, or whatever we call them then, Tea Garden Talk, I think it was. Joe Wakelin's garden in South Island, an extraordinarily bleak, harsh landscape, and this beautiful, very kind of ascetic garden. Anyway, Xanthe is in a completely different part of the country, Auckland, the very northern tip of New Zealand, where the climate kind of verges on the subtropical. And it's that really lush, tree, ferny kind of habitat that a lot of us find is really fascinating about New Zealand. Anyway, we included Xanthe in the book, and I was really struck by talking to her, so very keen to come back and make a recording. And we also hope to be doing a webinar with her in due course, although given the time difference, I'm not quite sure how we'll work that. Xanthe is just an incredibly good designer with plants. A lot of New Zealand natives, some are a mix. She's also really articulate about her work and about the business of design and landscape anyway. Talking with Xanthe is a real breath of fresh air and really inspiring, and actually intellectually really pretty stimulating. So introducing Xanthe White from Auckland, New Zealand. Xanthe, tell us about Auckland, the climate, the gardening culture, what happens generally in people's garden spaces.
So Auckland is heading into the northern, what we call the far north. So we're sort of the city closest to the north in terms of, so it's our most intensive city. So urban to suburban to surrounding countryside. And generally climatically, we're sort of sitting subtropical, but we have quite a diversity of climate because we have two coasts. So we have east coast and west coast. Their smallest distance of separation is just 1 kilometre. So, and the diversity between an east coast climate and the west coast climate is quite intense, as well as inland in the city as well also tends to start to see occasional frosts and things like that. But generally we're kind of humid, heavy kind of seasonal rainfall, and then kind of steamy summers, but coastal breezes that kind of make it all okay as well.
It does sound a rather nice place to garden.
It's a really nice place to garden.
Yeah.
I do garden around the country as well, and it just
Mm.
we enjoy the shift when we get into the cold areas, because there's you do notice that those cold clips allow you to grow certain things that you just can't grow in continuous warmth. We notice the further north we go, I've observed deciduous trees struggling in clay soils because essentially while they sleep, everything else grows, and the lichens and the mosses just suck them back down into the earth. It's sort of, you can't afford to sleep when everything else is still going on, you know. And so while they can handle the conditions, it's actually the competition that they're nodding around while everything else is gunning it. So
right, yes, interesting. Yeah, interesting parallel actually with here in Portugal, where summer is actually the main dormant season. But of course, deciduous trees are still actually functioning. I mean, their roots are obviously going down deeper, but it's but then they that you should say they're essentially going to sleep while during the winter, when everything else, a lot of other things are growing, albeit slowly. It's an odd sort of different time to head into.
I actually really appreciate you saying that, because it's taken me a long time to teach people to stop watering their gardens at the end of summer, and to allow them to rest, and that to make people understand that continuing to water a garden is forcing growth when everybody's sitting around sleeping, at the beach, swimming. It's like, why should your gardens keep working? So I understand what you're talking about very much. Kia ora koutou, my name's Xanthe White, and what I really wanted to talk about is essentially the culture around gardening in New Zealand. I called the title of this talk A Collision of Worlds, because essentially as a garden designer a Pākehā garden designer, which essentially is of English, Irish, Scottish descent, so forming part of New Zealand, which is Aotearoa. Our practice of gardening carries with it a consciousness of a culture that has collided with both a natural world and another cultural landscape, essentially. And so what I wanted to do was to kind of take you on a journey. I've been a landscape designer for 28 years now, and to essentially take you through a journey of my work, my understanding of landscape and the culture of landscape, and essentially kind of show where that tension lies, and the gains and solutions and I guess playfulness that I've explored through my work, and trying to come to terms with where the culture of gardening, which, as I say to people here, there's a reason you meet the Queen when you're the gardener, because us Pākehā take our gardening very seriously. It's a real cultural art form, and it's something which is highly valued in our society. It's an art, and the kind of understanding of horticulture has been essential to our flourishing in many ways as a culture. And so I came to landscape from a very naturalistic beginnings. Essentially, my father was a mountaineer, and we spent a lot of time tramping and trekking through. Did the Annapurna Trail in Nepal when I was 7, but primarily in the New Zealand landscape. And so I guess my appreciation of landscape came from that natural world. And as I was kind of surprised when I fell into the world of landscape design, because I guess I'd seen the beauty of landscape as something that was and that existed, as opposed to something that was created and formed. But I did have grandmothers who were very committed gardeners, either through, provenance of a grandmother who was a widow. Her husband, a judge, had passed when my dad was very young, so she was dependent on her garden for food, and another grandmother who really just understood landscape as an art, and the colour and the beauty, and taught me to appreciate flowers from that context. So I had the context of garden design as an art, but also, I guess, in my soul, my love of landscape is in the natural world. I thought I would start this work because this is just, I've just got thrown in a couple of shots from Chelsea Flower Show that I did when I was like 28 years old, so about 10 years into my career, quite a long time ago now, where I think essentially I was beginning to play with this idea about landscape and identity and replication of the natural landscape versus kind of landscape as an art form as well, in terms of contemporizing, I guess, pulling together my culture of garden with this kind of landscape. And I have to say, as a designer, I still feel a tension between these worlds. But as I entered back into my practice as a landscape designer, having sort of started from a very gardening foundation, building my own work, building walls, kind of doing everything, which is very much a kind of colonial kind of way of being, particularly back then, maybe less so now, more specialization now. But I was hit by, I guess I was confronted by some aspects of my own culture's relationship between garden and landscape. And I started to meet with these clients who would say to me, I don't want any natives in my garden. I'm sort of like, for me, this was baffling because I was sort of, you know, just in love with all nature, flowers, forest, all of it. It all seemed pretty wonderful to me. And I was sort of kind of slightly baffled by this idea that there was this separation, this segregation between the garden and the wild. And this idea, so it made me to start to kind of, I guess, explore the idea. And so I kind of pulled myself back into my roots. And as well as continuing my work with natives, I also began to kind of reconsider the gardening culture that I'd inherited from my grandmothers as well. Because I think until you understand your own culture, you can't really start to play with it and really start to bring it together. And I wanted to understand why we divided the world into wild and gardens, and where this anxiety and kind of intensity came from. And so as I started to look at a garden and to listen to people speaking about gardens, I began to understand more and more, which I think many of us do, that a garden really becomes a fabric of our memories. It becomes a place where when people garden, where they place the association with plants is very tied into our most intimate relationships with family and with friendship and with our memories and with our first tastes and our smells and experiences. And this is my little girl who's now a teenager running through one of our gardens, and I called this piece my grandma's garden. It was part of a much larger garden, but I called it Nanny's garden, you know, because it evoked all of those kind of rules about gardening that I'd been taught, and this idea that it was a place where you told stories of your connections to others. And it's where you plant, you garden when people die, you garden when people are born, people bring you plants on these occasions. And so therefore, when I guess the realization of what gardening had done to a very delicate ecology, what it had done in terms of disrupting and eradicating, and to the point of extinction, many parts of this ecology, which until our ancestors arrived was, you know, pretty much mammal free and a pretty intense forest, and is now greatly reduced. And so this kind of, when people were faced with having their gardens taken away from them, it was like having their fabric taken away from them. And so my work sort of started to look at how do I weave back this kind of relationship between the grandmother's garden, which I guess in some sense, when I am talking to a European audience, this is my grandmother is my relationship with Europe, and then with my land, which is the land of mana whenua, people of the land Aotearoa, and with this natural world, which in my framework, I call a natural world, but of course, this is also a cultural landscape. So as I started to understand my cultural landscape, it also started to help me to understand that in the same way we see things flower and tie them to times of year and to memories and to places and have these connections which tie us to each other. The natural landscape that we saw as a wild to be separated from the garden was tied to memories and place and identity in the same way that our gardens were tied to us. So not only were our gardens colonizing the space of an ecology, it was also a cultural colonization, a cultural occupation of space. And so this is quite conflicting because culture is important. And for me, maintaining my culture is quite important. And for me, to kind of encourage and entice the preservation of ecology and a cultural landscape, I wanted to see how my work and I could use beauty to bring these worlds together. And so I began to look at how we would take this kind of essentially European landscape, so worked with a lot of these plants, always bringing food into gardens. All of our projects have food in them. It doesn't matter whether you can see the food or not. There's always food in all of the gardens that we work with, because I see food as kind of the neutral zone, because all cultures agree that we feed and we take herbs from the garden. It's kind of the zone where we all come to agreement. I guess where all our memories combine, and we're all quite happy to eat each other's food and to share the fruits from different parts of the world. So all of our gardens kind of will have vegetable patches and growing in them. But I started to play with how these worlds could weave together. So from this very kind of floral, structured garden, I've played with different ways of colliding these worlds. So this is a garden where the person said they hated natives, none of my gardens. So we just instead started kind of forming natives into European shapes. So the totara, the lophomertus, just started clipping them tightly and pulling grasses through and sort of slowly weaving different things. And so they wouldn't know they were natives. And then they would say, oh, I love that. And I'd be like, it's a native. And so kind of like this idea that there's not this great divide between gardening and the natural world. And that here, this on the side of here, you can see shooting up is a big pahurikawa tree, which the client who I adore was like, that tree, if I could cut it down, I would. And this beautiful old tree. And so in a way of preserving the tree, we just planted the bank with Spanish shawl, and suddenly the tree became a treasured part of the garden. And it sort of highlighted it, and it kind of pulled it into acceptance. We have the totara protected as well. And then putting a straight line in front of the tree to allow the big pahurikawa tree for there to be a tidy edge, a sense of control within, and we've got the tikoko, the cordyceps coming up behind that as well. So kind of playing with the lines between order and wild. And then as well as that, bringing together the planting of natives with flower plants and playing with the combination of embedding natives that weren't necessarily particularly flamboyant even, but might be just little ground covers to create depth and layers in a gardenscape, and to essentially persuade people that these worlds are not separated, and that we can garden in a way that shifts what our children's memories will be. So we still have these moments of colour coming through, but we're also combining them with native plants, which also have flowers and leaf and, attract bees. One of the things that I struggle with too is we have a lot of kind of pressure to plant flowers to save bees, and yet bees love pahurikawa trees, and we make a huge amount of money exporting honey made in manuka trees, which is a native plant, and we don't actually need to put little things pollinating because they love the big groves of pahurikawa and manuka and harakiki, the flaxes and things. But we also try to bring in as much natural material as possible, and playing with foliage, exotics, and then pulling back natives with hellebores and detail. So I guess domesticating the wild and allowing people to see the wild as something which can be kind of that they can move within. And you can see the way we relate to, this is a big avocado tree that's coming into flower in the background there as well, that integration of food. And then as well as that, we play around with, I guess, using kind of materials, more European materials occupied with a totally native garden as well. So is it the materiality that speaks to heritage that makes people feel a connection to gardening, while we can use totally native plants such as the kawakawa, nikau, leptonellas, and these little details and the little things that make a garden magic. And then also just organizing native plants in a way that makes them very familiar as garden plants. And the idea is that over time that we're shifting the layers of memories, that instead of people remembering only things from overseas, they start to think of the beautiful, fall in love with the kind of clove flavicans, fall in love with the Carokia hedge, start to see the subtleties of some of these textures, isotoma flavicans and not a native fern on the right. We also do have this quite subtropical climate, so our planting has quite a Pacific influence, and Pacific culture and Asian culture is really important in Auckland. So we're not just talking about European culture and Māori culture in this collision as well. There's all sorts of plants, and we're a very international city with, lots of different people wanting different things. I guess different, we're working on a project at the moment with a client from who has Indonesian background, and so the things that evoke memories of home for her are very different to and very particular to her memories of home. Once again, lots of food, lots of outdoor living in our gardens as well, and primarily try to use architectural elements with as much minimal approach as possible. So then I still sit myself at the heart of my love being in the landscape. And so within this, I guess I'm going to take you further and further away from Europe as we go through the talk. And so as we move through these shifts in thinking, there's the patterning of plants such as these ringa, which are a native plant, which has the native planting behind Tikoka, Totara, Kowhai, Nikau, Podolite australis, Podocarps, and Sephora, and the ringa Arthropodium, with the kind of botanicals in the foreground. So we're sort of pulling back out of this. We've got, this in some ways expresses this idea of this collision of the wild, the forest, the borderland, and the culture land, and this kind of trying to find a harmony between these conversations. You can see here we have Xeronema callistemon, the poor night's lily, beautiful, amazing red flowers, and kind of tikoka. So primarily this is all native plants, but pulling just touches of flowers, touches of those memory plants in. To then the transition where we're really working in a state of ecological restoration, where we're essentially just clearing spaces within a landscape of restoration. So we're really just looking at moments that we can occupy and surrendering land back to landscape. In this project, one of the issues we have with restoration is people love simplification. They love simplification of approach. And so the idea that you can use manuka as a nursery plant, or 5 or 6 plants as plants that will kind of reinvigorate restorative planting, is one that's very popular. I personally challenge it as an approach because I think it's a simplification that doesn't read landscape. And if you think about the diversity that goes into a small domestic garden, to then take a monoculture approach to land restoration, whilst it works on a level, it has weaknesses to it. So beneath this manuka, the client had been struggling to get any restoration, any regeneration beneath it in the understory. And it was essentially not, a very kind of sterile environment beneath the trees. So one of the main purposes in this, main activators that we did in this garden was actually we interwove underneath the manuka a whole lot of timber and epiphytes. So we approached a local arborist, and they brought to us a whole lot of wooded material, tree branches that came down in the storm, especially if they had epiphytes and things growing on them already. That was a plusage. And we just laid them through the understory, and then we're able to put some bark and plant in it. And the difference between, they'd been trying to plant for several seasons with no success, putting that wooded material back onto the forest floor, the difference in the regeneration and the diversity that we were able to achieve was totally significant. So here we're in an approach where we're leaving the garden, and we are redesigning the landscape. We're releasing land back to the wild, but at the same time, it requires a methodology, and it especially requires a methodology if you want to do so in a way that will achieve diversity, as opposed to just a monoculture. Sort of heading back to the garden, but this idea of how we move. So the idea of the courtyard garden, which in a more, I guess, traditional sense is seen as a haven from the outside world. I like to think of a courtyard garden as a kind of I guess, almost like a wall to protect nature from us gardeners. So and we're kind of cloistering our desire for plants and planting and, our kind of foraging and protecting the landscape by holding it within these kind of bound walls. So that the garden still exists, but the landscape is free outside of it to be what it is. And we can kind of take shelter in our courtyard gardens. So this house really takes you through a sequence of gardens that are really channeling the idea. So a lot of fragrance, citrus, fruit trees, the Trachelospermum, exotic things, native Mulembekia climbing up old Totara walls. The house floats through the courtyards of the gardens. We've got roses with tropical things, really trying to get that idea that it's all about senses and experience and places to sit away from the landscape and to essentially be within a house. Beautiful barbecue that opens up for your cooking here. Quite a different look. You can see here I've got Australian frangipani with native ground covers and Graham Thomas rose, plum tree. And then when we reach the landscape, we disappear. The designer disappears as much as possible and releases into what is there, and our response becomes as minimal as possible, and we stop our busyness and apart from sort of a little softening fringing of the concrete, and we release everything to the elements. So this idea that the gardener is kind of shackled and still has a place in cultivation and the gardener, that gardening is important, but at the same time, there's this tension between garden and landscape and conversation between garden and landscape that starts to speak of place and culture. And so here we have Mamaku with the crested leopard, and this whole garden was composed around Metrosideros Pohurikawa, yellow Pohurikawa, which is quite rare, and there was one in this garden. So the garden includes native plantings, coastal native plantings, and then any color in it was all based on the tones, so the yellows to soft to bring out the story of that Pohurikawa tree. And you can see here as the garden's got older, we've got Tecamanthe speciosa. Now this vine, there were 3 left on an island, and it was discovered, put into propagation, and now essentially exists purely because of horticulture and gardening. And so it's a really beautiful example of how gardening does have relevance to ecology. It can actually enhance and protect ecology if it's done in a conscious way. So one of our things with plants too is when we use exotic plants, we try to make sure that we use things that we know well behaved. So we tend to choose sterile varieties or varieties that we know will kind of stay contained within a site, and avoid wilding plants that we know could be problematic to the environment. I'm just going to show you a short video because I feel it kind of shows you expresses in some ways the sense that we are gardening. The point where we garden and where landscape begins is we try to work in a way that it's almost kind of seamless as to the point that the landscape starts and the garden begins. And we're looking at a landscape that may have more exotics in it in the garden, even though the garden may appear to have more exotics in it than the landscape. So we're kind of fusing these two things and these two worlds together constantly. And here we have an example of a landscape, the sort of landscape colonization that I'm sort of talking about in terms of the interruption of the natural landscape. Here we have a totally unique, once unique dune ecology where the depth of the sand in these sand dunes is 2 kilometers in depth. So huge sand beds that once was this sort of, incredibly unique and delicate ecology, which was then planted in forestry. And so we have a situation here, we have this pine forest, which is being reclaimed by a kind of high-end development. And to achieve the high-end development, basically the price of the exclusivity of the development was a level of landscape restoration that could not be achieved without the development funding it. So the number of houses are very limited and the standard of ecological restoration is incredibly high. So if we have a look through, and essentially see we're going from pine. So all these native plants are all reintroduced species collected from ecology in terms of restoring this kind of unique landscape. So this is sort of the site that we met with as the pine trees have been taken out, a little bit of initial planting's been done, and there's also a golf course out there on the horizon, which when people at work say, but is it sustainable? I just say, the point is that when it becomes unsustainable, we need to make sure there's enough ecology there to reclaim it, essentially. And so in terms of then we've got this kind of these high-end houses coming in, astroturf on the roof, people who love golf, and we're looking at how do we do it again. So once again, our concept is to maintain these kind of cloistered, that the garden itself remains cloistered. So our cloistered garden here, very much the forms of the paving out the front, very much speaking to the architecture of the house. Yet when you go to the landscape, we're releasing it. So here, just subtle lines, speaking, kind of bridging architecture and the sand, essentially, try to be as essentially pull the architecture down out of itself and into place. And subtly, so that when we look through into the landscape, it feels like there was a landscape that once was there, even though actually the reality is that this is a man-made landscape or man-restored landscape in a pine forest. The aim is to create a sense that we were never here. And pulling that kind of pattern into that more cloistered landscape. And then in here, there we have that spring, some drama, the permission to garden, the permission to kind of be a bit more dramatic, a bit more architectural, a bit more playful, but still maintaining that connection and that coloration of outside of that, the landscape. We have a pūrikaua forest to one side, replacing the pine forests. And then in the back, you can see these are pūrikauas we've all planted through here. And these will gradually replace the pine forest as it goes back through. And the dunes are now looking hearty and healthy and natural, though not. So these lines between where nature and nurture and culture and ecology sit is kind of abstract in some ways, because interference is such. So we're kind of playing a game of illusion. And here you can see the miscanthus in the background with the hebes and Mulembekia. And I sort of felt that miscanthus was a good thing to throw in there, because it's sort of one thing that the work when we're trying to, I guess, decolonize or merge culture in terms of our approach to landscape. I call it the Pinterest effect, where the continual seductive beauty of the magic of work overseas is kind of, even for you as a designer, is luring you in. You want to play with the plants that other people are playing with, and you want to try the tricks that other people are doing, and your clients want to see these things. And yet the principles and the values which sit beneath these landscapes are actually, if you import them into your own place, are utterly corroded. And so it's almost offensive to the landscapes that you admire to try and completely replicate them in a different context. This garden here sits in a heritage zone, which generally requires a white picket fence. And yet it is one of the most important areas, volcanic areas, and I guess for mana whenua, the local iwi, one of the most important areas of their rohi, their territory. And so we sort of challenged the idea, as there was no villa on the site, that we would do a historic landscape, but we would take it back further. We would go deeper into place and context and culture, essentially. So we have here kowhai and Mulumbekia. I'm a bit obsessed with Mulumbekia. Totara hedge on the side, Potocarpus, the volcanic rock. So all of the rock in this project came from the site. Massive lava flows through this area. So the one area where the house essentially flows over the landscape, the one area where they wanted to blast for the garage was, of course, where the lava flow was complete solid rock. So what that gave us was this wonderful material to work with. So we really wanted to take people on a journey away from this very European kind of streetscape into a more natural world, pulling away. This is the Mulumbekia axillaris, Tikoka cordyline australis, some xeronema, and oh, sorry, going the wrong way. The idea of the steps is quite a long path up to the house, and so deliberately trying to slow that journey up into the space using local, the paving was local stone we kind of found on free cycles. Sallia radicans, which is another ground cover, which is very salt tolerant, and Pamelia prostrata, another native ground cover with a soft scent, sometimes called New Zealand Daphne, and the Astonii as well, which so one of my love of native plants, which I think speaks a lot to the appreciation in terms of the movement of the principles of the new perennial garden, and the movement and the appreciation of plants as they go through phases. And I think one of the things that I've related to most critically in terms of my reflection of my own work is the negative space that is created by plants of texture, the void between, and what essentially happens with these plants and the way light hits them, and how in a photo they might look blurred or insignificant, but when you sit in the landscape or you see them in the gardenscape, what they do to the translucency, to the light and the water, and what they do in terms of the movement, the negative space, there's all this energy that exists in that, which is a different sort of beauty, and a subtler beauty. I also am obsessed with goat tracks, and the idea that of making paths that people think aren't paths, and the idea that you're taking people into the landscape within their garden. So I love to play with little bits of steps that tend to get used more because primarily they're put in paths of desire to encourage people to misbehave, but creating these little paths through gardens which give people that pleasure of bouncing on rocks and stones and being led up the garden path in a way that is quite, I think, diffusing in terms of how we see our spaces. And the other thing I like to do with work is this recognition of culture in gardens. And this garden, the couple, the husband is from the South Island, loves native plants, is firmly rooted in that landscape, and his wife is Sri Lankan. And so the garden takes you from this very austere landscape into this lush, completely subtropical kind of, once again, almost cloistered garden, otherworldly garden, and transports you into this really tropical zone, where the worlds kind of blend together again, and we start to get pops of color and taro. So Cassonia leaves in the background, papyrus, there's a pool hidden behind that papyrus. But still using the stone from the site, working heaps with contour to create kind of experience and depth of space, and enhanced finding the suburban garden, being able to pull contour up, and allows you to achieve a lot more in terms of planting composition. I love steep sites because they just give me more garden. I will it's unusual to see me put in a retaining wall, because if I can get a batter and get it planted, then that will always be my preference. It's like the more plants and diversity you can get into here. So yeah, this idea that we journey, that a garden is a journey through culture and place, and it's this constant collision of culture and place. And here, this is one of the original colonial buildings here, which was an old horses stable, which is quite unusual for central Auckland to have something like this in a garden. And so we've framed that in quite a symmetrical way with Tikoka, the Cordyline australis. So this very kind of common native plant, but used in a very European way against the stable. So once again, you get that sense of this world colliding with the world that we carried with us when our families moved here. So you can see from that contemporary house, so this is all one garden, but the journey through and the experience through the worlds is kind of very evocative. I mentioned contour and the interruption of space. We try not to interrupt contour unless we're doing so to hold water in the landscape. So I'm really a lot of my work focuses around how we maintain water in the water tables and in the landscape. So I spend a lot of time trying to use contour to create pathways for water so it doesn't all get piped out to sea and our water tables sink. So Auckland is one of the rainiest cities in New Zealand, and yet we've been faced with water shortages where we haven't been able to water our gardens for 3 months because supposedly we don't have any water. And so how we treat our water tables and our aquifers is kind of, people are starting to realize they can tank water, but they're not really thinking about how they actually maintain water in a landscape, through landscape, and how they maintain it in a way that's well. So contour is really important in that. It's also important in interrupting architecture and anchoring architecture into space. So when you pull contour up into an architectural form, it creates a sense that the building has been forced to go around the landscape, as opposed to the landscape has been kind of decoration around the house. So I like to create a sense of tension between landscape and that architecture, that it feels like I came first, essentially, in terms of the context. These images really just that touching into that wild kind of textural, essentially gardens that are about light, color, texture, and seem subdued in photography, but when you sit in them in terms of the translucency of light and the texture and the form, we've got Apodasmia similis and Euphorbia glauca, Pamelia prostrata here, those textures and that I guess dreaminess that we get from those sorts of plants. Another sort of influence, which I'm not quite sure which way round it goes, is probably that we do sit in the Pacific Asiatic kind of region, and our food is very influenced by this. Our culture is very influenced by this, these pushes and pulls. And my family has my uncle was one of the first trade commissioners in Japan after the war, great uncle. And so I've always had this strong relationship with Japan, and I'm not sure whether there's an influence in my work which comes from having worked in Japan and looked at Japanese culture, or if the root of the influence comes from the quest for simplicity and an authenticity of material from local places, and an examination of that material and looking at how we can kind of just use different pieces of material, kind of compile as opposed to kind of import, I guess. And I guess that relates to materiality as well as to plants. This idea that, that when that in terms of a rock, like the various forms of paving and the machine marks to the rough surfaces, that all of these things, when I go to a quarry and look at a piece of material, every piece fascinates me and I can't quite decide which I like more. So sort of organizing and looking, the garden becomes an arrangement of observing the stone itself. And so, yeah, there's some of my work which I think is influenced from spending time in Japan, but I think also some of it comes from actually the source of natural landscape and exploration of nature itself in terms of it. And I thought this was kind of a nice project to end on. We've got Wharaiki, the Phormium kukianum in that shot, and we've got a little native geranium here, little Kowhai seed heads, native hibiscus. We've also just got this rock colliding with this wall, which we didn't build the wall around the rock. I put the rock there and built the wall into the rock because I wanted to watch the rock grow. This stone is quite porous and quite alive, and so we do clean the wall and leave the rock to kind of become this beautiful organic form. I am fascinated by rock and rock as part of the life cycle. I think I became fascinated with wood in terms of trying to do soil management and activate soil in naturalistic ways, and then I've become very aware that rock also forms part of that soil ecology and part of the life of a garden and space. And I find it very hard to separate rock as from the living world, the more I work with it and study the life that's compressed within stone. And it's almost like your understanding of your garden and your landscape processes isn't complete till you understand what is embedded in stone. And so I feel like the collision of the stone and the wall and the planting, the very native planting around it, is quite representative of where my mind tends to end up sitting in relation to landscape, as the designer attempting to control and make space and, you know, imprint ego upon a space. But then in the essence, what fascinates me about landscape is this life, that what kind of happens, happens when I'm gone, essentially. I like to think that one day the works that I'm working on at the moment, which are bigger scale, one day in 200 years, people will be like, they'll be sort of starting to come to recognition, into realization. So like how we work in like large pattern scales as we do landscape restoration to guide people through kind of ecological restoration, that I like the idea of creating something which has this pattern which outlives yourself, and kind of, yeah, being a catalyst for kind of a playfulness that expands into the horizon, essentially. Yeah.
Great.
So thank you.
We'll stop sharing screen. You can do that. Yeah. Great. Fantastic. I'm in some wonderful gardens, obviously, but your commentary I find very insightful. You know, you raise a lot of issues. There's a lot to think about here. I mean, visually, what struck me was the ground covers. which is something most of us are actually very bad at, that if you're talking about creating layers of vegetation for biodiversity and just to simply get all those layers in, it's that very minimal layer of the ground that we tend not to fill. So much imagery here of ground covers that are filling in every available bit of space. Now, are a lot of those natives?
Well, I would say probably 99% of them are natives.
Is New Zealand?
It's sort of a place where I can always get those little things in.
Yes.
But I think also I spend a lot of time in the forest, and in the forest there's so much strata. So when I really struggle to do a planting plan, like you can for a perennial border, I struggle to do planting plans that don't work on many strata. Like they need a lot of layers to them, and the smaller the space gets, I almost feel like the more layers of plants I need to stack this way in terms of a mamaku and then a shrub and then a grass and then a ground cover, and so that way of planting is really important.
Do you think the New Zealand flora is particularly rich in good little ground hugging species, or are you just good at picking them out?
I think it's funny because I love dirt. Like I am really interested in soil, and I spend a lot of time observing soil and the way soil works, and the way water and soil works is like I spend a lot of time before I plant kind of studying that, but I really don't ever want to see soil.
No.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to shut the door.
Oh, good.
I'll edit that bit out. I was very interested early on. You talked about having some natives which you were clipping, and this seems to me to get to the heart of the kind of nature culture relationship, because classical garden styles involved a lot of clipping. They were basically about, especially here in the Mediterranean, a garden was something with clipped box or whatever. And consequently, there's been a lot of reaction against that. I mean, talking to American gardeners, for instance, it's very difficult to have a sensible conversation about clipping because it is done so badly that it puts everyone off. And yet, and looking at Pete Aldov's career, in his earlier days, he did a lot of clipping, which was very much part of this Dutch modernist tradition, and you being really quite adventurous about what you used. And unfortunately, because everyone loves the big perennials and grasses, that side of what he does, we see very little of now. We've always been rather intrigued by the idea of clipping non-conventional material, which of course, particularly when you talk about natives, it's really bringing together the natural and the cultural. Do you think there's a lot more potential here, or was that perhaps just a one-off?
Oh no, it's something that if anybody who works in my studio, they all start to go to sleep when I start talking about this, because it's this whole thing of the garden and the wild as being these separate things. So it's almost like if it's native, you can't touch it, and if it's a garden, then you can do whatever you want to it. And the two worlds shall never meet. And it's like, so therefore you end up with trees that are either just chopped down and, continually chopped down, or trees that are never chopped down and become kind of, people slowly kind of wilt beneath them. And so I spend a lot of time trying to teach people we need a culture of pruning, especially in our cities and our suburban environments, because you to have trees in an urban environment, you need to shape and form them. You need to learn how to. So we spend a lot of time with our clients teaching them how to see the shape of trees and how to let light through trees. And we try to entice them into the shares by talking about, the glow and translucency and shafts of light through. But also we spend a lot of time talking about a garden skeleton, and it really doesn't like, even if you're using native plants in a small garden, you need to have form and structure and skeleton to your garden. Your garden needs bones and it needs a structure to it. And so clipping, it's like plants like being clipped. Birds like trees that they can fly through and sit on the branches. It's not an awful thing to do to a plant. So I love trying to find difference. There's a puriri tree here, which everybody thinks is a very big tree. And I've seen it cut down to very small sizes, and you can take cuttings from anything. It will regrow from, you could basically take a trunk and, you know, like of a huge old tree and pop it down and it would just start shooting away again. And I'm just like, can we please play with this? You know, like this is definitely something that can be formed. So I think the art of clipping is actually, like, this is I guess my kind of my life's confusion and work is this: where is the place of the garden in a wild world? Like there is a place for gardening. Gardening is essential to us in our culture and our traditions, but it's also how you bring people into landscape. You know, some people are afraid of landscape, and so we just say, walk with each person on their journey, and we make gardeners, not gardens. So we teach people how to find their journey in, which is why our work kind of floats from this sort of almost, you know, like my garden is very wild and very free, and I love it like that. But it's sort of like, I know not everybody's going to be able to cope or manage, or I do prune my trees a lot, you know, to keep them looking completely natural. So it's sort of like this dance between gardens maintain our relationship with the natural world, even in the smallest of spaces. And the cultivation and the skills of gardening are really important to me, and culturally really important to me. It's like, so it's how to kind of find culture that that's respectful and doesn't create, so we use it, we don't use prunus that will flower, flow through the bush, that will seed all through the bush, because the tuis love them, but they spread the seed everywhere. So we use sterile cherries, prunus, if we use prunus. So we kind of just like do so in a conscious way.
Right.
But there is space for culture and wildness.
Yeah. No, I think
and let's be honest, all these wild gardens are cultural gardens.
Oh, totally.
They're all promoting values.
Yeah.
They're all promoting ideas.
There is no such thing as a natural garden. I mean,
no.
Yes.
And you look at these landscapes, these ecologies, these ecological restorations, these rewildings. These are people patterns. And I think that's why they often become monocultures and they lose their complexity. And so a lot of the work with those projects is, how do we embed complexity at that scale? Because you can't embed complexity at 1 to 500. No.
Yeah.
You can't get the ground covers in.
Yes, and you have to create something that it can then develop over time, so that you're designing a trajectory rather than a.
Totally, and something that's going to be transformative as well. Like you're planting in all our gardens. We plant for death. Like we plant for the things that lure people in at first to dissolve and other things to take form. I think that's the wonderful thing about our art. We talk a lot about the seasons and the cycles in that time, but there's the changeover, like time that we're working in so many spectrums. We don't work in 3 dimensions. We definitely work in at least 4 when it comes to time. And we work not just above the earth, we work beneath. What we're doing works beneath the earth, which is why contour is really important to me, and rock and wood, because even though I don't like seeing soil in my work, our work is, whatever we do on top is growing down.
Totally dependent on what you can't see. Yes.
Yeah, it's so cool.
Yeah. I was very interested in, earlier on, again, you said about always including some food in gardens, and of course there are far more things we can eat or forage than you would grow in a vegetable garden. And obviously an ornamental garden is a very good place to grow things, but just off the top of my head, hostas, and not your hostas, of course, you're going to eat. I was actually meant to say Hemerocallis, which we do eat. I don't grow any in my current garden, but I mean, in the past, Hemerocallis flower buds was something beautiful and forage. Is that a way of bringing in Maori culture in terms of traditional forage plants?
So yes, so we use. So one of the things with Maori culture is it's also one of the things when you live in a country that's heavily colonized, you become very conscious of, is that kind of bringing other people's culture into your own isn't really the way to do it. What you do, so we use lots of native plants. We acknowledge things like there's knowledge that we carry with them, but it's actually, so when we work in public space, it's very much about collaboration. So it's about making space for other people to occupy. So some of our big projects, public projects, a lot of the space making might be about activation of space in terms of creating a nursery where plants can be propagated for land restoration, creating marakai, which will be gardened by other people. So the form of landscape is not as important as the activation of relationship with land and the space to allow other people to actively use land in the way that they see is right. And so for me, I guess I'm more like taking responsibility for me as a Pākehā and my European culture in this world is to, I guess, move us into a different relationship with the land where we don't see ourselves divided from it. And we see our culture of gardening as something which can be done in a kind of graceful and acceptable way, like that we respect, because our culture of gardening is important. It's very important to me. And I think it has value to the work, to everybody in our society, if it's done in a respectful way and it's done with understanding around that. Understanding that what I'm doing is culture helps me to understand that there is other ways of seeing that land, which means that when I meet people with different views and different lenses, I can make space for them to occupy it in different ways than I might. And so it's sort of this, it's about kind of process and but absolutely there a lot of work we do with schools, we make sure that there's like, the marakai, the food garden, we will put in a marakumara, we'll put in a food forest, which will include permaculture techniques and also native forest plants that you can understand the foraging of with kawakawa and things like that as well as Pacific plants with bananas and taros and those sorts of things. So this idea that gardening occupies many different methodologies and different values.
Yes. The final point I'm going to pick up on, which I remember you when we emailed you talked about. I think it's something I picked up from your website. Actually, was talking about beauty. Beauty with a capital B, which is not something we actually talk very much about. Historically, it has always been really at the core of human culture. I mean, where an awful lot of human cultural activity is about creating beauty. And I think if you would have talked to many previous generations of gardeners, they would have said, we are trying to create something beautiful. But it's almost like a no concept at the moment. And certainly in terms of other areas, perhaps like architecture, the idea that contemporary architects are creating beautiful buildings, I think a lot of them would kind of shy away from that. And I think that there's a lot of layers here, one of which is simply a gender one, that talking about beauty is somehow girly, and that despite the fact that we have far more women working in architecture and landscape architecture and horticulture in many fields than ever before, there is a very sort of quite kind of macho thing about larger scale design, which does not want to talk about beauty.
Yeah, I think there's a whole concept that around women's work, around what a woman does versus what the importance and those different ways we value work, depending on who's doing it. And like holding my space as a woman in landscaping has been something I've had to kind of reflect upon at certain times, because I have been in many environments where I have been the only woman working in a group of all male kind of designers. And there is a difference in sometimes I have joked with friends that I did find that a lot of kind of males' designs were kind of decoration around an object, whereas our work was more about immersing within a space, and you could kind of work all sorts of metaphors into these kind of things of wombs and phallics and all sorts of things like this. And I mean, some of my best work is I am invisible in, because it is about space and culture and activation for others. So a good designer should be able to disappear in their work as much as stop forward in their work. And I think to say that beauty is not in your work is dishonest, because we are all drawn to beauty, but also to not actively and productively use beauty as a tool when you have a world that's in a critical state, because we've separated ourselves out instead of seeing ourselves, because of this idea that there is the garden here and the wild here, and there is not a line between the two. It is our ecology. None of the world is untouched by our human footprint. Everything is altered and changed by us, and we are living in a human ecology. We are the ecology of our landscape spaces and our garden spaces. And beauty is the most firing tool we have to engage people with that reality, and to bring people and draw people into having a relationship with their space. Without beauty, it's the panda, like for conservation. It's like it's the seducer, and to not use it as a design tool is lazy, like why would you not use one of the most powerful tools we have, which is the beauty of the natural world? Why would you deny beauty as something frivolous? And I mean, my work, some people would say, is less beautiful sometimes than, like, I verge from garishly pretty to quite austere and quite stripped back. But I think that's because I see beauty in all of it. Like, to me, it's all beautiful. And it's the seeing the beauty in those different levels of tone and tune, and being able to tie people into those different kind of rhythms and energies and moments, and to see that different people connect in different ways, and just to bind everyone in. I think, it is, beauty is everything. It's our power move, man.
A great note on which to end. Thank you, Xanthe. That was fascinating. I mean, some really interesting, thought-provoking stuff there, as well as fantastic design. And I think from a climate zone and region we've not covered much in our coverage so far. So thank you very much indeed, and very much hope actually that Annie and I can talk to you about doing some of our web, doing some actual teaching for us at some point. I think you've got a huge amount to contribute. So thank you very much indeed, and